The first reading that we heard is from the book of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah was often referred to as the reluctant prophet. He didn't really want to be a prophet, but he felt called to be a prophet. And often what he had to announce sounded like bad news. So who wants to be the announcer of bad news? But sometimes we have to hear bad news or difficult news before we can hear the good news. And fortunately, in this section of Jeremiah's book, he gets to announce good news. And the good news is that he's telling the Israelites that finally, after all these years of exile, they get to go home. They get to go home. Now, those of you who've been away from home for long periods of time know how wonderful it is to be able to go home, especially if you've been in a foreign country where you have to learn their language, their customs, their money exchange, transportation, everything that is unfamiliar to you, how you long to return home. There's no place like home, as they say. And so we can have compassion on people who have lost their homes, whether that be through natural disasters like fires and floods, as we know very recently on the West Coast that's happened, but certainly in other parts of the country. We can also have a lot of compassion for refugees and migrant workers, people who have to leave their families and who are very much alone. There is no place like home. And we all get to go home at least once in a while. In the gospel today, Jesus is fulfilling the prophecy of Jeremiah. Jesus is returning home and bringing with him the lame, the blind, the mothers, those who are vulnerable, those who are on the margins of life. And he's on his way to Jerusalem, which is his city. Unfortunately, he's moving towards his passion and his death in Mark's gospel at this point. And as he passes through Jericho, which is about 15 miles, I guess, south of Jerusalem, he encounters a blind man alongside of the road. And it's interesting because it says that the blind man heard that Jesus of Nazareth was passing. He couldn't see him, but he heard. But Bartimaeus, even though he was physically blind, had deep spiritual insight. He recognized Jesus as the Messiah. He even calls him Son of God, which is a term for the Messiah. So this blind man could see Jesus more clearly than even his disciples. As a matter of fact, his disciples, especially in Mark's gospel, they never quite get it. They never quite recognize who Jesus really is. But this blind man does. And ironically, in Mark's gospel, the demons know who he is. They even say, "We know who you are, Jesus of Nazareth. We know who you are." And of course, the disciples and the crowd, they try to silence Bartimaeus. They try to silence him. And Jesus notices that, and he stops and he says, "Call him over here." And then they rush over and they say, get up, get up. It's almost like it's their idea. All of a sudden they steal Jesus' idea. Go on, you want to go see him. And it says that Bartimaeus threw off his cloak, sprang up, and ran to Jesus. Well, what does that cloak represent, do you think? It was probably the only thing that he owned. And he was willing to risk everything in order to meet Jesus. And sometimes we have a cloak. We have something that binds us. We have something that holds us back. And we're not quite willing to throw it off, like Bartimaeus. But you might ask yourself, is there something holding you back? Is there something holding me back? I can think of all sorts of things. And am I ready to get up and run to Jesus? And then Jesus asks him, what do you want me to do for you? Well, you know, we think, isn't it obvious? Isn't it obvious that he wants to see? But Jesus asks him, what do you want me to do for you? And he says, Lord, that I may see. And Jesus said, your faith has healed you. Go on your way. Well, Bartimaeus doesn't go on his way. He goes on Jesus' way. It says, then he followed him in procession to Jerusalem. He was willing to follow Jesus to his passion and death. Jesus is going home. After 33 years of having left his heavenly home, Jesus is now returning. And each of us eventually have to return home. Each of us eventually will have to leave this home and return to where we first began, in the heart of God. And so let us pray that we will have the trust to be willing to leave this home and return to God. And if Jesus were to ask you this morning, what do you want me to do for you? What would you tell him? What would you want Jesus to do for you?